East of Eden, Chapter 2, Part 2. When people first came to the West, particularly from the owned and fought-over farmlets of Europe, and saw so much land to be had for the signing of a paper and the building of a foundation, an itching land greed seemed to come over them. They wanted more and more land, good land if possible, but land anyway. Perhaps they had filaments of memory of feudal Europe, where great families became and remained great because they owned things. The early settlers took up and land they didn't need and couldn't use. They took up worthless land just to own it, and all proportions changed. A man who might have been well-to-do on 10 acres in Europe was rat poor on 2,000 in California. It wasn't very long until all the land in the barren hills near King City and Sanado were taken up. Ragged families were scattered through the hills, trying their best to scratch a living from the thin, flinty soil. They and the coyotes lived clever, despairing, submarginal lives. They landed with no money, no equipment, no tools, no credit, and particularly with no knowledge of the new country and no technique for using it. I don't know whether it was a divine stupidity or a great faith that let them do it. Surely such venture is nearly gone from the world. And the families did survive and grow. They had a tool or a weapon that is also nearly gone, or perhaps it's only dormant for a while. It is argued that because they believed thoroughly in a just moral God, they could put their faith there and let the smaller securities take care of themselves. But I think that because they trusted themselves and respected themselves as individuals, because they knew beyond doubt that they were valuable and potentially moral units, because of this, they could give God their own courage and dignity and then receive it back. Such things have disappeared perhaps because men do not trust themselves anymore, and when that happens there's nothing left except perhaps to find some strong, sure man, even though he may be wrong, and to dangle from his coat-tails. While many people came to the Salinas Valley penniless, there were others who, having sold out somewhere else, arrived with money to start a new life. These usually bought land, but good land, and built their houses of planed lumber and had carpets and coloured glass diamond panes in their windows. There were numbers of these families, and they got the good land of the valley and cleared the yellow mustard away and planted wheat. Such a man was Adam Trask. Chapter 3. Adam Trask was born on a farm on the outskirts of a little town which was not far from a big town in Connecticut. He was an only son, and he was born 6 months after his father was mustered into a Connecticut regiment in 1862. Adam's mother ran the farm, bore Adam, and still had time to embrace a primitive theosophy. She felt that her husband would surely be killed by the wild and barbarous rebels, and she prepared herself to get in touch with him in what she called the beyond. He came home 6 weeks after Adam was born. His right leg was off at the knee. He stomped in on a crude wooden leg he himself had carved out of beechwood, and already it was splitting. He had in his pocket, and placed on the parlour table, the lead bullet they had given him to bite while they cut off his frayed leg. Adam's father, Cyrus, was something of a devil, had always been wild, drove a two-wheeled cart too fast, and managed to make his wooden leg seem jaunty and desirable. He'd enjoyed his military career, what there was of it. Being wild by nature, he had liked his brief period of training and the drinking and gambling and whoring that went with it. Then he marched south with a group of replacements, and he enjoyed that too, seeing the country and stealing chickens and chasing rebel girls up into the haystacks. The grey, despairing weariness of protracted manoeuvres and combat did not touch him. The first time he saw the enemy was at 8 o'clock one spring morning, and at 8:30 he was hit in the right leg by a heavy slug that mashed and splintered the bones beyond repair. Even then he was lucky, for the rebels retreated and the field surgeons moved up immediately. Cyrus Trask did have his 5 minutes of horror while they cut the shreds away and sawed the bone off square and burned the open flesh. The tooth marks in the bullet proved that. And there was considerable pain while the wound healed under the unusually septic conditions in the hospitals of that day. But Cyrus had vitality and swagger. While he was carving his beechwood leg and hobbling about on a crutch, he contracted a particularly virulent dose of the clap from a Negro girl who whistled at him from under a pile of lumber and charged him 10 cents. When he had his new leg and painfully knew his condition, he hobbled about for days looking for the girl. He told his bunkmates what he was going to do when he found her. He planned to cut off her ears and her nose with his pocket knife and get his money back. Carving on his wooden leg, he showed his friends how he would cut her. "When I finish her, she'll be a funny-looking bitch," he said. "I'll make her so a drunk Indian won't take her out after her." His light of love must have sensed his intentions, for he never found her. By the time Cyrus was released from the hospital and the army, his gonorrhea was dried up. When he got home to Connecticut, there remained only enough of it for his wife. Mrs. Trask was a pale, inside-herself woman. No heat of sun ever reddened her cheeks, and no open laughter raised the corners of her mouth. She used religion as a therapy for the ills of the world and of herself, and she changed the religion to fit the ill. When she found that the theosophy she had developed for communication with a dead husband was not necessary, she cast about for some new unhappiness. Her search was quickly rewarded by the infection Cyrus brought home from the war. And as soon as she was aware that a condition existed, she devised a new theology. Her god of communication became a god of vengeance, to her the most satisfactory deity she had devised so far, and as it turned out, the last. It was quite easy for her to attribute her condition to certain dreams she had experienced while her husband was away. But the disease was not punishment enough for her nocturnal philandering. Her new god was an expert in punishment. He demanded of her a sacrifice. She searched her mind for some proper, egotistical humility, and almost happily arrived at the sacrifice herself. It took her 2 weeks to write her last letter, with revisions and correct spelling. In it she confessed to crimes she could not possibly have committed, and admitted faults far beyond her capacity. And then, dressed in a secretly made shroud, she went out on a moonlight night and drowned herself in a pond so shallow that she had to get down to her knees in mud and hold her head under water. This required great willpower. As the warm unconsciousness finally crept over her, she was thinking with some irritation of how her white lawn shroud would have mud down the front when they pulled her out in the morning. And it did. Cyrus Trask mourned for his wife with a keg of whiskey and 3 old army friends who had dropped in on their way home to Maine. Baby Adam cried a good deal at the beginning of the wake, for the mourners, not knowing about babies, had neglected to feed him. Cyrus soon solved the problem. He dipped a rag in whiskey and gave it to the baby to suck, and after 3 or 4 dippings, young Adam went to sleep. Several times during the morning period he awakened and complained and got the dipped rag again and went to sleep. The baby was drunk for 2 days and a half. Whatever may have happened in his developing brain, it proved beneficial to his metabolism. From that 2.5 days he gained an iron health, and when at the end of 3 days his father finally went out and bought a goat, Adam drank the milk greedily, vomited, drank more, and was on his way. His father did not find the reaction alarming, since he was doing the same thing. Within a month, Cyrus Trask's choice fell on the 17-year-old daughter of a neighbouring farmer. The courtship was quick and realistic. There was no doubt in anybody's mind about his intentions. They were honourable and reasonable. Her father abetted the courtship. He had 2 younger daughters, and Alice, the oldest, was 17. This was her first proposal. Cyrus wanted a woman to take care of Adam. He needed someone to keep house and cook, and a servant cost money. He was a vigorous man, and needed the body of a woman, and that too cost money, unless you were married to it. Within 2 weeks, Cyrus had wooed, wedded, bedded, and impregnated her. His neighbours did not find his action hasty. It was quite normal in that day for a man to use up 3 or 4 wives in a normal lifetime. Alice Trask had a number of admirable qualities. She was a deep scrubber and a corner cleaner in the house. She was not very pretty, so there was no need to watch her. Her eyes were pale, her complexion sallow, and her teeth crooked, but she was extremely healthy and never complained during her pregnancy. Whether she liked children or not, no one ever knew. She was not asked. She never said anything unless she was asked. From Cyrus's point of view, this was possibly the greatest of her virtues. She never offered any opinion or statement, and when a man was talking, she gave a vague impression of listening while she went about doing the housework. The youth, inexperience, and taciturnity of Alice Trask all turned out to be assets for Cyrus. While he continued to operate his farm as such farms were operated in the neighbourhood, he entered on a new career, that of the old soldier. And that energy which had made him wild now made him thoughtful. No one now, outside of the War Department, knew the quality and duration of his service. His wooden leg was at once a certificate of proof of his soldiering and a guarantee that he wouldn't ever have to do it again. Timidly, he began to tell Alice about his campaigns, but as his technique grew, so did his battles. At the very first he knew he was lying, but it was not long before he was equally sure that every one of his stories was true. Before he had entered the service, he had not been much interested in warfare. Now he bought every book about war, read every report, subscribed to the New York papers, studied maps. His knowledge of geography had been shaky and his information about the fighting non-existent. Now he became an authority. He knew not only the battles, movements, campaigns, but also the units involved, down to the regiments, their colonels, and where they originated. And from telling, he became convinced that he had been there. All of this was a gradual development, and it took place while Adam was growing to boyhood, and his young half-brother behind him. Adam and little Charles would sit silent and respectful, while their father explained how every general thought and planned, and where they had made their mistakes, and what they should have done. And then, he had known it at the time, he had told Grant and McClellan where they were wrong, and had begged them to take his analysis of the situation. Invariably they refused his advice, and only afterward he was proved right. There was one thing Cyrus did not do, and perhaps it was clever of him. He never once promoted himself to non-commissioned rank. Private Trask he began, and Private Trask he remained. In the total telling, it made him at once the most mobile and ubiquitous private in the history of warfare. It made it necessary for him to be in as many as 4 places at once. But perhaps instinctively, he did not tell those stories close to each other. Alice and the boys had a complete picture of him. A private soldier, and proud of it, who not only happened to be where every spectacular and important action was taking place, but who wandered freely into staff meetings and joined or dissented in the decisions of general officers. The death of Lincoln caught Cyrus in the pit of the stomach. Always he remembered how he felt when he first heard the news, and he could never mention it or hear of it without quick tears in his eyes. And while he never actually said it, you got the indestructible impression that Private Cyrus Trask was one of Lincoln's closest, warmest, and most trusted friends. When Mr. Lincoln wanted to know about the army, the real army, not those prancing dummies in gold braid, he turned to Private Trask. How Cyrus managed to make this understood without saying it was a triumph of insinuation. No one could call him a liar, and this was mainly because the lie was in his head, and any truth coming from his mouth carried the colour of the lie. Quite early he began to write letters and then articles about the conduct of the war, and his conclusions were intelligent and convincing. Indeed, Cyrus developed an excellent military mind. His criticisms, both of the war as it had been conducted and of the army organisation as it persisted, was irresistibly penetrating. His articles in various magazines attracted attention. His letters to the War Department, printed simultaneously in the newspapers, began to have a sharp effect in decisions on the army. Perhaps it if the Grand Army of the Republic had not assumed political force and direction, his voice might not have been heard so clearly in Washington. But the spokesman for a bloc of nearly 1 million men was not to be ignored, and such a voice in military matters Cyrus Trask became. It came about that he was consulted in matters of army organisation, in officer relationships, in personnel and equipment. His expertness was apparent to everyone who heard him. He had a genius for the military. More than that, he was one of those responsible for the organisation of the GAR as a cohesive and potent force in the national life. After several unpaid offices in that organisation, he took a paid secretaryship which he kept for the rest of his life. He travelled from one end of the country to the other, attending conventions, meetings and encampments. So much for his public life. His private life was also laced through with his new profession. He was a man devoted. His house and farm he organised on a military basis. He demanded and got reports on the conduct of his private economy. It's probable that Alice preferred it this way. She was not a talker. A terse report was easiest for her. She was busy with the growing boys and with keeping the house clean and the clothes washed. Also, she had to conserve her energy, though she did not mention this in any of her reports. Without warning, her energy would leave her. She'd have to sit down and wait until it came back. In the night, she'd be drenched with perspiration. She knew perfectly well that she had what was called consumption. Would have known even if she was not reminded by a hard, exhausting cough. And she did not know how long she would live. Some people wasted on for quite a few years. There wasn't any rule about it. Perhaps she didn't dare to mention it to her husband. He had devised a method for dealing with sickness which resembled punishment. A stomachache was treated with a purge so violent that it was a wonder anyone survived it. If she had mentioned her condition, Cyrus might have started a treatment which would have killed her off before her consumption could have done it. Besides, as Cyrus became more military, his wife learned the only technique through which a soldier can survive. She never made herself noticeable, never spoke unless spoken to, performed what was expected and no more, and tried for no promotions. She became a rear-rank private. It was much easier that way. Alice retired to the background until she was barely visible at all. It was the little boys who really caught it. Cyrus had decided that even though the army was not perfect, it was still the only honourable profession for a man. He mourned the fact that he could not be a permanent soldier because of his wooden leg, but he couldn't imagine any career for his sons except the army. He felt a man should learn soldiering from the ranks as he had. Then he'd know what it was about from experience, not from charts and textbooks. He taught them the manual of arms when they could barely walk. By the time they were in grade school, close-order drill was as natural as breathing and as hateful as hell. He kept them hard with exercises, beating out the rhythm with a stick on his wooden leg. He made them walk for miles, carrying knapsacks loaded with stones to make their shoulders strong. He worked constantly on their marksmanship in the woodlot behind the house. When a child first catches adults out, when it first walks into his grave little head that adults do not have divine intelligence, that their judgments are not always wise, their thinking true, their sentences just, his world falls into panicked desolation. The gods are fallen and all safety gone. And there's one sure thing about the fall of gods: they do not fall a little. They crash and shatter or sink deeply into green muck. It is a tedious job to build them up again. They never quite shine, and the child's world is never quite whole again. It is an aching kind of growing. Adam found his father out. It wasn't that his father changed, but that some new quality came to Adam. He'd always hated the discipline, as every normal animal does, but it was just and true and inevitable as measles, not to be denied or cursed, only to be hated. And then, it was very fast, almost a click in the brain. Adam knew that, for him at least, his father's methods had no reference to anything in the world but his father. The techniques and training were not designed for the boys at all, but only to make Cyrus a great man. And the same click in the brain told Adam that his father was not a great man, that he was indeed a very strong-willed and concentrated little man, wearing a huge busby. Who knows what causes this? A look in the eye, a lie found out, a moment of hesitation, then God comes crashing down in a child's brain. Young Adam was always an obedient child. Something in him shrank from violence, from contention, from the silent, shrieking tensions that can rip at a house. He contributed to the quiet he wished for by offering no violence, no contention, and to do this he had to retire into secretness, since there is some violence in everyone. He covered his life with a veil of vagueness, while behind his quiet eyes a rich, full life went on. This did not protect him from assault, but it allowed him an immunity. His half-brother Charles, only a little over a year younger, grew up with his father's assertiveness. Charles was a natural athlete, with instinctive timing and coordination, and the competitor's will to win over others, which makes for success in the world. Young Charles won all contests with Adam, whether they involved skill or strength or quick intelligence, and won them so easily that quite early he lost interest and had to find his competition among other children. Thus it came about that a kind of affection grew up between the two boys. But it was more like an association between brother and sister than between brothers. Charles fought any boy who challenged or slurred Adam, and usually won. He protected Adam from his father's harshness with lies and even blame-taking. Charles felt for his brother the affection one has for helpless things, for blind puppies and new babies. Adam looked out of his covered brain, out the long tunnels of his eyes, at the people of his world. His father, a one-legged natural force at first, installed justly to make little boys feel littler and stupid boys aware of their stupidity. And then, after God had crashed, he saw his father as the policeman laid on by birth, the officer who might be circumvented or fooled but never challenged. And out of the long tunnels of his eyes, Adam saw his half-brother Charles as a bright being of another species, gifted with muscle and bones, speed and alertness, quite on a different plane, to be admired as one admires the sleek, lazy danger of a black leopard, not by any chance to be compared with oneself. And it would no more have occurred to Adam to confide in his brother, to tell him the hunger, the grey dreams, the plans and silent pleasures that lay at the back of the tunnelled eyes, than to share his thoughts with a lovely tree or a pheasant in flight. Adam was glad of Charles the way a woman is glad of a fat diamond, and he depended on his brother in the way that same woman depends on the diamond's glitter and the self-security tied up in its worth. But love, affection, empathy were beyond conception. Toward Alice Trask, Adam concealed a feeling that was akin to a warm shame. She was not his mother, and he knew because he had been told many times. Not from things said, but from the tone in which other things were said, he knew that he had once had a mother, and that she had done some shameful thing, such as forgetting the chickens or missing the target on the range in the woodlot, and as a result of her fault she was not here. Adam thought sometimes that if he could only find out what sin it was she had committed, why, he'd sin it too and not be here. Alice treated the boys equally, washed them and fed them, and left everything else to their father, who had let it be known clearly and with finality that training the boys physically and mentally was his exclusive province. Even praise and reprimand he would not delegate. Alice never complained, quarrelled, laughed or cried. Her mouth was trained to a line that concealed nothing and offered nothing too. But once when Adam was quite small, he wandered silently into the kitchen. Alice did not see him. She was darning socks, and she was smiling. Adam retired secretly and walked out of the house and into the woodlot to a sheltered place behind a stump that he knew well. He settled deep between the protecting roots. Adam was as shocked as though he had come upon her naked. He breathed excitedly, high against his throat. For Alice had been naked, she had been smiling. He wondered how she dared such wantonness, and he ached towards her with a longing that was passionate and hot. He did not know what it was about, but all the long lack of holding, of rocking, of caressing, the hunger for breast and nipple, and the softness of a lap, and the voice tone of love and compassion, and the sweet feeling of anxiety, all of those were in his passion. He did not know it, because he did not know that such things existed. So how could he miss them? Of course, it occurred to him that he might be wrong, that some misbegotten shadow had fallen across his face and warped his seeing. So he cast back to the sharp picture in his head, and he knew that the eyes were smiling too. Twisted light could do one or the other, but not both. He stalked her then, game-wise, as he had the woodchucks on the knoll when, day after day, he had lain lifeless as a young stone and watched the old wary chucks bring their children out to sun. He spied on Alice, hidden from an unsuspected eye-corner, and it was true. Sometimes when she was alone, and she knew she was alone, she permitted her mind to play in a garden, and she smiled. And it was wonderful to see how quickly she could drive the smile to earth, the way the woodchucks hold their children. Adam concealed his treasure deep in his tunnels, but he was inclined to pay for his pleasure with something. Alice began to find gifts. In her sewing basket, in her worn-out purse, under her pillow, 2 cinnamon pinks, a bluebird's tail feather, half a stick of green sealing wax, a stolen handkerchief. At first Alice was startled, but then that passed, and when she found some unsuspected present, the garden smile flashed and disappeared the way a trout crosses a knife of sunshine in a pool. She asked no questions and made no comment. Her coughing was very bad at night, so loud and disturbing that Cyrus had at last to put her in another room, or he would not have got no sleep. But he did visit her very often, hopping on his one bare foot, steadying himself with hand on wall. The boys could hear and feel the jar of his body through the house as he hopped to and from Alice's bed. As Adam grew, he feared one thing more than his father. He feared the day he would be taken and enlisted in the army. His father never let him forget that such a time would come. He spoke of it often. It was Adam who needed the army to make a man of him. Charles was pretty near a man already, and Charles was a man, and a dangerous man, even at 15, and when Adam was 16. The affection between the two boys had grown with the years. It may be that part of Charles's feeling was contempt, but it was a protective contempt. It happened that one evening the boys were playing pee-wee, a new game to them, in the dooryard. A small pointed stick was laid on the ground, then struck near one end with a bat. The small stick flew into the air and then was batted as far as possible. Adam was not good at games, but by some accident of eye and timing he beat his brother at pee-wee. 4 times he drove the pee-wee farther than Charles did. It was a new experience to him, and a wild flush came over him, so he didn't watch and feel out his brother's mood as he usually did. The 5th time he drove the pee-wee, it flew humming like a bee far out in the field. He turned happily to face Charles, and suddenly he froze deep in his chest. The hatred in Charles's face frightened him. "I guess it was just an accident," he said lamely. "I bet I couldn't do it again." Charles set his pee-wee, struck it, and as it rose into the air, swung at it and missed. Charles moved slowly toward Adam, his eyes cold and non-committal. Adam edged away in terror. He did not dare to turn and run, for his brother could outrun him. He backed slowly away, his eyes frightened and his throat dry. Charles moved close and struck him in the face with his bat. Adam covered his bleeding nose with his hands, and Charles swung his bat, hit him in the ribs, knocking the wind out of him, swung at his head and knocked him out. And as Adam lay unconscious on the ground, Charles kicked him heavily in the stomach and walked away. After a while, Adam became conscious. He breathed shallowly because his chest hurt. He tried to sit up and fell back at the wrench of the torn muscles over his stomach. He saw Alice looking out, and there was something in her face that he had never seen before. He did not know what it was, but it was not soft or weak, and it might be hatred. She saw that he was looking at her, dropped the curtains into place, and disappeared. When Adam finally got up from the ground and bent over into the kitchen, he found a basin of hot water standing ready for him and a clean towel beside it. He could hear his stepmother coughing in her room. Charles had one great quality. He was never sorry, ever. He never mentioned the beating, apparently never thought of it again. But Adam made very sure that he didn't win again at anything. He'd always felt the danger in his brother, but now he understood that he must never win unless he was prepared to kill Charles. Charles was not sorry. He had very simply fulfilled himself.